Welcome back to the Daily Dope. I'm your host and commentator, Brandon. Hit the subscribe button because you're going to want to stick around for this shit. Alright, so back to Michigan, which is unfortunately my home state, so I have to fucking keep people informed, keep them abreast of what's going down. And so far, the story I've been putting out is that there's been this corporate takeover of the medical marijuana program in Michigan, which was a pretty successful program for the first 8 years or so that it was around, 8 or 9 years. And then Lansing, who's a far right wing, a bunch of Republican corrupt motherfuckers, decided that they were gonna, finally get around to doing some regulations. Unfortunately, the regulations that they did completely ignored the successful program that was already operating pretty good without regulations. I've heard it called things like the Wild Wild West and all this other shit because, you had caregivers that had an overabundance of cannabis and they provided their patients with free or sometimes relatively free or really cheap cannabis because they were, even though it wasn't legal or the dispensaries weren't ever allowed before the Lansing laws, people were taking their overage or their extra cannabis that they produced above and beyond what was needed to provide the cannabis to their patients and themselves to the dispensaries, and they would sell their cannabis there, right there in a public area with a sign out front with business hours, security, local police is okay, local government, town halls or chamber of commerce or whatever, allowing it to happen or saying it was okay. Sure, the police came around and busted a bunch of dispensaries a few times over the years and deemed them illegal and whatnot. But if everything I just said before that sounds pretty legitimate, sounds like, hey, these guys are providing a good service, these dispensaries, for the caregivers who were put in an awkward position by the law in 2008 when they were told that their extra weed, was just basically, there was nothing in the law to tell you what to do with that extra weed. There was no dispensary thing. It just allowed caregivers to grow a certain amount, which was 2.5 ounces of weed for patients out of the patient's 12 plants, and then boom, you have all this extra cannabis. So the dispensaries were brought into the light with the new law, albeit some harsh regulation numbers as far as, taxes, assessments, fees, licensing fees and assessments, licensing fees that you have to pay your local government as well as the state, and that also goes for assessments. They finally hammered out some stuff about the taxes for dispensaries, but what they did along with that is something completely off the hook. This is not, I don't even think this is possible what they did, but they implemented a new tax for patients that get their cannabis from caregivers. Now they have to pay a 6% sales tax or some kind of tax. They can't call it I don't think they can call it a sales tax. We'll get into that in a minute. So a lot of people were giving their patients free medicine or really cheap medicine because they were able to get the compensation they needed for the growing by selling the rest of the medicine to the dispensary, and then therefore the dispensary was able to then provide cannabis to people that didn't have caregivers because there's only so many caregivers. I would argue that caregivers should have been allowed a certain amount of plants and then just, you can have no limits on how many patients If you were allowed to grow 100 plants, you could probably service like 7 or 8 patients, no problem, maybe even 10. I don't know. The way they did it just kind of left us, caregivers holding the bag. And now the state is trying to tax patients that get their products from caregivers. Now let's read this article. This is just, to me, this is just totally absurd. And it's just a long shot by the state who wants this corporate marijuana takeover, corporate medical marijuana takeover. The state. That's who this is. The state wants to clear the way, clear out anybody that's growing that isn't paying them their registration fees and their licensing fees and their assessment fees and all these taxes. But yet they don't want to bring caregivers in at all. They don't want to just say, okay, caregivers, now you're allowed to take your weed to the fucking testing lab, and then you can sell it at dispensaries just like all these people that have these big facilities. Because caregivers can max out at 72 plants. All right, the minimum for one of the licensed grow facilities is 500 plants. It's a big leap for a caregiver to go from 72 plants to 500 plants. Most caregivers aren't even thinking about getting one of these licensed grows. And I don't see why you would, because it would totally be doing something different than being a caregiver. Being a caregiver, you have patients. I personally care about my patients, so I don't see how it would make sense to just be like, hey, patients, sorry guys, I'm about to go jump on this giant facility and grow 500 or 1,500 or more plants. I can't do anything with the plants, so I can't, it ain't like I could sneak some bud out the back door and still give you the weed I give you every month. And now, if you did give patients weed, you're going to have this uncomfortable situation where you have to fucking tell them, yo, I got to get some money from you because I'm not allowed to sell to the dispensaries anymore. Well, isn't that just lovely? A lot of patients are fucking broke. They couldn't afford medical marijuana if they, wanted to go to the dispensary. Well, let's read this article by Rick Thompson. Also lives around this area where I live, in the Flint area. And he's been an activist for quite some time. I've probably read 2 or 3 of his articles on this channel before. So thank you again, Rick Thompson, keeping your nose on the grindstone. He is pretty much at every major function in Michigan that has anything to do with cannabis. So, big thank you goes to Rick Thompson. Can't say it enough. So anyway, new patient tax stuns Michigan medical marijuana community. January 18th directive from Michigan Department of Treasury demands patient pay 6% tax on all patient caregiver transactions with no new change in law to spark this issue. And there's really, I don't see how you can wiggle this one in. You'll see how it's crazy in a second. So, Michigan medical marijuana patients are expected to pay a 3% MMFLA tax and 6% sales tax on purchases from dispensaries under Michigan's new cannabis distribution program as required by law. That's another thing they just hammered out. This is part of the process of which was illustrated in the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, that they would have to make the rules and then put the rules out to the public. And this is one of them, that the tax is 3% on excise and 6% sales tax. And now there's also a reversal of policy from the Department of Treasury, which requires patients not using dispensaries to pay a 6% penalty too. And that has the patient services community up in arms. In Revenue Administration Bulletin 2018-2, issued January 18th by the Department of Treasury, has decided to reinterpret the MMMA language and reverse their previous position on the taxation of cannabis sales. Every time a patient purchases cannabis from a registered caregiver, the patient must log the sale and self-report a 6% use tax on the transaction per the new directive. I have several problems with all this. First of all, what they're saying here is every time a patient purchases cannabis from their registered caregiver. This is what they're doing. It's not a purchase. The caregiver doesn't run a store. They're not making a sale. Whatever they're going to say later on about how they wiggled this in, just remember this definition of remuneration. The act of remunerating. Pay, recompensate. By definition, it's just not... it's not an sale. I don't know. It's not a payment for... It's not a purchase of... It's not like I'm just going to go to the caregiver and purchase cannabis. That implies that the cannabis was probably like a supply that the caregiver may have bought himself. And it is true that a caregiver, even though they're allowed to grow 12 plants for a patient, there's nowhere in the law that says that the caregiver has to grow these 12 plants. Or there's nowhere in the law actually that says anything about what the caregiver has to provide to the patient. But it does say in the law that a patient is allowed to give the caregiver money for remuneration of services. Remuneration. Having a little trouble with that word. The Michigan Department of Treasury is exceeding its authority by implementing a new patient tax that requires registered patients to pay a 6% use tax on medical cannabis purchased from their caregiver, wrote Matthew Abel, founding partner of the law firm Cannabis Counsel PLC and executive director of Michigan Normal. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. That's an understatement, I guess. The policy change comes without any associated change in the MMMA language or court result, leaving the state's 300,000 patients questioning the logic and the timing of the policy change. Well, you know, you can act like you're sitting there scratching your head, but we know what this is about. This is about throwing a wrench, if you may, at the caregiver-patient model, which the state police asked if they could just outright get rid of last year. This is just further action of them chipping away at the morale of the caregivers out there. For real. I mean, there's no other explanation for this. It's to add an extra burden and stress of record keeping, which if you're a caregiver, I highly recommend that you don't keep any records of anything that you do, because the cops don't care. I've seen bust after bust after bust of caregivers grow operations where the cops don't even care about whether you have cards or not. Even if they ask for them, it's not something they care about. They still take everything you got and put everybody in jail with charges. Whether or not you could use fucking medical marijuana for a defense or not, we'll figure out later. But for right now, as far as the cops on the scene are concerned, they're going to play as ignorant and dumb about the law as they want to. And they're just going to throw everybody in jail and take everything that's worth money. They're really just looking for the money, too. This new tax structure puts significant additional legal burden on caregivers operating in an already murky area of the law, said attorney Bruce Leach. Quote, it signals the state's clear intent to make caregiving as difficult as possible while the state moves to eventually eliminate caregivers altogether in favor of the regulated commercial market. If the state is going to implement this tax system, then it is only fair that caregivers be allowed to have their goods properly enter into the regulated market. I've been saying that since this law was passed in 2008, that there should be a way for us to legally, an avenue for extra weed that caregivers produce to be sold. No one's ever cared about that. I've never heard any of these activist lawyers actually go to one of the meetings where they were hammering out any of these rules, or were allowed to. Maybe they weren't even allowed to when they were hammering out the MMFLA. that I know of. And if they were, why wasn't this a major talking point the whole way through it? At least you could get people on record saying that they didn't want to do it. But thank you, Bruce Leach, for that. Caregivers are prevented from selling their goods through the state's new dispensary system. Patients purchasing directly from a caregiver was a tax-free transaction for the first 8 years of the MMMA, but now the definition of what is medicine and what is not seems to have morphed into a new phase, which conveniently allows the state to make people pay for medicinal products. Quote, Michigan doesn't tax medicine and we shouldn't tax medical cannabis, said Jeff Irwin, candidate for state senate and former House of Representatives, especially when it is a critical tool in the fight against opioid abuse. Just in general, I mean, especially when it's helping people with any condition. There should be no reason to pay for any medical product. And establishing the legitimacy, this is the fucking kicker, guys. Check this one out. And establishing the legitimacy of taxing cannabis at the Treasury Bulletin identifies marijuana and marijuana-infused products as non-medicine because their use is not governed by a prescription or written by a physician. Oh, really? But instead it is derived from a recommendation written by a physician. Why should that fucking matter? If it's medicine, it's medicine, and if the physician is recommending it through whether it's a prescription or not, it's still fucking medicine. The doctor didn't say, oh, you know what? Here, I know it'll make you feel better. Go eat a fucking cheeseburger at McDonald's. That's not what the doctor did with a recommendation. A recommendation is a formal piece of paper where the doctor is saying, yes, you should use medical marijuana because it's medicine for your fucking condition. So that's a bullshit argument. However, in denying the tax-exempt status of cannabis foods, their own bulletin identifies cannabis product as medicinal in this statement. So now remember, at one time, they were like, oh, we can tax the food that's medical marijuana. Marijuana-infused products are not eligible for this exemption because they are consumed for their medicinal value rather than for their taste or nutrition. So in that situation, they're saying, well, you know, this brownie over here, we can't tax that because it has medicine in it. But over here, they're saying, well, you know, that's not medicine because it's not prescribed with an actual prescription. I would say go challenge that one there. The one where they're saying, oh, it's not medicine because the doctor recommended it. Doctors don't recommend shit that's not medicine. You know, even physical therapy is considered medicine. It isn't something physical that you take and you eat it like a pill. That's not the qualification for what is medicine. Go after that. And you could even go after the other one. It is medicine, period. If you're saying that a fucking brownie with THC in it is medicine, so don't tax it, well, then the same thing applies for everything that's medicine, because medical marijuana is just medicine. The state admits that. The state had to admit that in order to have the MMFLA even exist in the first place. Them imposing taxes on medical marijuana products is something that they can do in their regulated facilities. As long as you understand there's a difference between them selling medical marijuana products and a caregiver providing a service to a patient by providing them with medicine. And we'll get into that one in a little bit more towards the end here. A letter opposing the change in how patients are treated by the state was sent from Michigan NORML, the Michigan chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, to see all legislators on Thursday, January 25th. All state legislators got a copy of this. Okay, guys? So it wouldn't hurt if you found out who your actual state rep is and write them a letter too, just to let people know that everybody is pissed off about this and don't know why anybody ain't fighting against it up there in Lansing. I mean, I could guess why, but, you know, come on. In an April 2011 letter, Director of the Bureau of Tax Policy Glenn R. White indicated that MMA recharacterizes what otherwise might be a taxable sale of a tangible personal property as a non-taxable caregiver service, and that the MMA does not authorize either a regulatory or enforcement role for the Department of Treasury. Two very well taken points there. The Michigan Normal Letter cites the MMMA and identifies a new decision to issue a use tax on patients as a penalty would violate the 2008 Voter Directive Initiative. Attorneys and advocates agree that, quote, there is no basis or precedent for this ruling, said Matthew Abel. It seems entirely constructed from some type of wishful thinking on the part of government. Brad Forrester is a board member of the Michigan Normal Group from Sheboygan. When asked what impact this new policy would have on patients, Forrester responded, quote, the patients who comply with this new policy will place themselves and their caregivers at a high risk for arrest and prosecution simply by identifying themselves. Let me just go ahead and repeat that. The patients who comply with this new policy will place themselves and their caregivers at a higher risk for arrest and prosecution simply by identifying themselves. Patients and caregivers now face a brand new risk, arrest for prosecution for income tax evasion. And conversely, by complying, they are forced to divulge personal information that is confidential under the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, but not confidential on the open records of our tax system. In other words, if you pay the tax, you're admitting that you're a patient, and if they want to look at your records as to why you paid that tax, you should have a record of who your caregiver is, because you made a purchase from that person. If they, that's the kind of thing that tax lawyers would tell you. But when it comes to the Medical Marijuana Act of 2008, the registry is supposed to be sealed. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is supposed to look at that registry. Not the federal government, not the DEA, not the CIA, not the FBI, not the Attorney General of the United States, not the Attorney General of Michigan, not the State Police of Michigan, not anybody, period. The registry isn't even supposed to be churned into a mailing list and shit sent to people on the registry like fucking Laura already did. So other than just being able to know that you're in the registry, nobody's allowed to look at the registry. No one's allowed to use the registry. You get the point, man. As a criminal defense lawyer who represents patients and their caregivers, I'm concerned that tax rules could be used by law enforcement as another tool to violate privacy rights and to prosecute those who are doing their best to follow the Medical Marijuana Act. And Southwest Michigan Attorney Daniel Groh, past chair of the marijuana law section of the State Bar Association. So he used to be the chair of the marijuana law section of the State Bar Association. Forrester echoed that sentiment. Quote, I can only imagine how overzealous cops and prosecutors will leverage this new law to help them squeeze patients and caregivers for some kind of lopsided plea agreement. So, basically saying that they could use this tax as like an open season kind of way to basically shut down caregivers and patients. But let's be clear here. There's 300,000 patients in Michigan-ish. I'm not sure what the current number of caregivers is, but I think it's somewhere around 50,000. Don't quote me on that. I have no idea, but I'm just going to say that if anybody in the Michigan government doesn't like the prospect of Jeff Sessions coming in and cracking down on Michigan's medical marijuana program, or for example, like let's just say that one of these big players got their, they got their licenses all stacked up and they're growing 5,000 plants. They have dispensaries in like 3 major cities. They have processing centers all over the state. They own a transporter company and they're transporting weed for themselves and others. You know what I mean? Are you seeing the picture I'm painting? So these people are really good friends with the Lansing because they're paying a lot of fees and taxes and all this shit. All of a sudden, Jeff Sessions comes in and shuts him down and gives them all indictments for RICO. Would you like that, Lansing? Because that's kind of the fucking same threat you guys are putting on patients and caregivers with this bullshit. You're acting like, oh yeah, you do this new thing that you didn't have to do for the last 8 years. Do this new thing that's totally illegal and doesn't make any fucking sense. And if you don't do it, then we're going to get you. And if you do it, we're still going to get you. But if you do it, we're going to come and round you up. Because we now know who you are. And we now know that we can do our illegal Michigan-style rounded up and forfeiture violations and violate all your rights. Because that's what fucking raids in Michigan look like. And yes, they generally say you can't use medical marijuana as a defense. They always do. It's almost like part of your first line of defense is trying to prove that you can actually do that. So, totally bullshit. What's my opinion on this? You probably heard it throughout the clip, but I think it's total bullshit. First of all, you don't have to do this for the 2017 tax year. So if anybody's filling out some forms right now to do their taxes in April and thinks that they should fucking, write down a bunch of shit and then pay Lansing for 6%, if you're doing this right now, stop. Put the fucking pen down. Don't do that. Do not comply with this shit in any way, shape, or form. That would be the first step, is civil disobedience. Do not comply with an unlawful order. That would be the first step for all patients. They can come and arrest me for fucking inciting people to do the right thing or something. But I'm telling you, that's your first step, is don't fucking do this. The second step is to wait, because I'm pretty sure this is going to the Supreme Court. There's no way that this is gonna stand, and there's no way that people are gonna do this. Another thing that you can do, that I plan on doing, just for the heck of it, I don't keep records because it's just building evidence. But what you could do is you could write up a little agreement. These are all variables that you can change. Like, here's an agreement, and it basically just says, hey, we're going to do it like this. The caregiver is going to give the patient this much of this per this many every so often. And then the patient's going to, as a form of remuneration of time, labor, and equipment and supply costs, the patient will provide the caregiver with X amount of dollars every so often. You know what I mean? This is just a generic thing I found, but yeah, this is right there is basically an agreement that would nullify this idea that a patient is buying fucking weed from a caregiver, because that's not what the law says. That's not what we are assuming that we're doing. We're not doing that. We're not selling weed products to fucking patients. Like, my patients don't, someone's patients in Michigan, generally speaking, there's an agreement between the patient and the caregiver. Now, this isn't anything that's required by law. This isn't anything that is like standard operating procedure or any of that shit. This is just something that kind of organically formed because people in the marijuana world are, generally speaking, pretty good people. They're pretty generous people. They're nice people. They're not the kind of people that want to just, they're not greedy. They're not the people that are just trying to rake people over the coals to get as much money as they can, and who cares about how they treat the customers. That's not what it is. They're not customers. They're patients. You sign up with a patient, and the card is good for 2 years. So you automatically are signing up for a 2-year relationship with somebody where you're providing them with medicine. All right? It has nothing to do with them buying weed off you. And then you grow their plants, and then you give them a certain amount of weed that they're allowed to have. You can even have weed aside. For every 12 plants, you can give them 2.5 ounces right off the rip, And then you can hold 2.5 ounces more for them for later on down the line. But the rest of it now, caregivers are just, I guess, stuck with the rest of it. I guess the rest of that, off the 12 plants, you just gave the patient 5 ounces total. And now the rest of it, who knows what the fuck. So caregivers have no outlet for it. And it doesn't make any sense. So I want to hear more from these cannabis lawyers in Michigan. I appreciate that they're already taking a stand against this, but they've been pretty silent throughout the whole process, in my opinion. All right. And I know Rick Thompson hasn't been silent throughout this. And I know others haven't been too silent, but it seems like we should get some kind of action, a lawsuit maybe. Can we sue Lansing for really like just trying to fuck with the caregiver patient model? Is it that time yet? Because it's pretty clear that they're trying to do that. All right, that's all I got on this. Please help out in the comments section by saying something about it. If you're from Michigan, you should be extremely pissed about this, no matter where you fall on the issues. I don't care if you're like for abrogation or you like legalizing marijuana and taxing and regulating, or you're somebody that don't like either of those and just want to be totally underground and black market about it. No matter who you are, this shit is not fucking cool. All right.